Today's forum is part of two of our discussion about early childhood brain development and CMC and Bricker and Eckler's Our Healthy Community series. We welcome well-known author and doctor Bruce Perry, who leads the Child Trauma Academy in Houston, Texas, and Brad Mitchell, Senior Director of Leadership at Battelle for Kids, who will host the forum after opening remarks. Thanks to presenting sponsors of the Our Healthy Community series, Bricker and Eckler, and a special thanks to Jane Wide and her team at Franklin County Family and Children First Council, who were instrumental in bringing Dr. Perry to Columbus. Thank you. And thanks to the Childhood League Center for their partnership in this event. Please welcome Dr. Bruce Perry to start off today's presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm actually very honored to be here, and I appreciate this opportunity. I'm looking forward to the conversation that we will have in a few minutes. But first, what I would like to do is put the conversation that we're going to have in a little bit of broader context. And one of the reasons that I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to groups like this is that you all are leaders in your community. You are coming from multiple different walks of life. You have significant influence on how things work in your community and how things can change in your community. And in a very real way, you are involved in a process that I would like to make the subject of my little brief introduction. And that process is social cultural evolution. That process is essentially a brain-mediated manifestation of the human species that makes us remarkably unique in the natural world. And the organ that allows us to undergo this remarkable transformation from generation to generation to generation is the human brain. So, let me just back up for a second and talk about this. We are sitting in a room that's a beautiful room. It was built in 1915, I understand. But it's a box. And it's an invented box. And there's certain architectural elements to this room, and there's certain things. There's artificial light created by electricity. There are chairs, which are invented products. We're wearing clothes that are invented. I'm wearing glasses so I can actually see you. I would not have done very well in the natural world. I would have probably been eaten quickly. Human beings are biological creatures. We have been on this planet for at least 200,000 years in this genetic form. Yet 200,000 years ago, human beings lived very differently than we live today. 1,000 years ago, we lived very differently than we live today. It's interesting that this remarkable capacity of human beings to invent a new way of being is something that is always taking place. Human beings are always capable of adapting to their environment, of creating new things and passing those new things on to the next generation. This is a remarkable capacity. But not everything that we invent is a good idea. Human beings, over the course of our history, have invented all kinds of things that are really not good. We invented anti-Semitism. We invented racism. We invented misogyny. We invented slavery. We invented a lot of things that we shouldn't pass on. One of the things that's happened in the evolution of our species, the social cultural evolution of our species, is that there are certain biological gifts that we have as a species that we have been disrespectful of in the inventing process. And two of these are absolutely essential to the long-term success of our species. The first one is the fundamental neurobiological capacity to form and maintain relationships. Human beings are relational creatures. And in the inventing process, in the last 400 years, we have become increasingly disrespectful of relationships. We're more compartmentalized. We don't live together the same way we used to. We've created learning environments where there is a ratio of 1 developmentally mature individual for 30 developmentally immature individuals as a mechanism for teaching. So if you think about human beings in the natural world, we lived in very small, multi-family, multi-generational groups, 40 to 50 people. That's the way we lived the majority of the time we've been on this planet. In a group like that, there was developmental heterogeneity. There were grandmas and babies and infants and toddlers all in the same space. But as we've invented the present, we have become increasingly compartmentalized. In the average living group 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago was 20 or so people in continuous relational interaction. In the last U.S. Census, 1/3 of the people in the U.S. were in single-person households. In not this last census, but the census before that, the average size of the American family was less than 3. And in that family, people were not spending as much time relationally. In fact, a recent survey of the use of digital objects showed that the typical American spends 11 hours engaged with digital devices over the course of a day. And the typical American child spends 6 hours in front of a television per day. So we've gone from this relationally dense environment where human beings had much more relational contact. In fact, if you were in a hunter-gatherer group or a multi-family, multi-generational group at population equilibrium, and you were under the age of 6, there were 4 developmentally more mature individuals who could nurture you, protect you, model for you, discipline you, all of the things that help you grow up in a healthy way. But now we think that if you are a child that's 4 or 5 years old and you go to a preschool environment and there's 1 teacher and 6 kids, that's a good ratio. I would call that relational poverty. There's parts of your brain that are crucial for forming and maintaining relationships, for developing the capacity to be humane, to be empathic, to be capable of sharing, to be capable of self-sacrifice for the people in your family, in your community. And those parts of the brain develop very much like other parts of the brain in a use-dependent way. What that means is your ability to read, your ability to speak and have sort of good vocabulary is related to the number of words spoken to you. Repetition, 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 that builds your vocabulary. If you want to get better at a motor skill, you practice, you practice, you practice, you practice. Repetition, repetition, repetition makes you good at the motor skill. If you want to be empathic and capable of reading and responding to human beings in a healthy, positive way so that you can be regulated by people and you can be rewarded by people, you need repetition with human beings, which means that the number of relational interactions you have during the day with people who are attentive and attuned and truly present with you makes a huge difference in how your capacity to be humane develops. And if you look at the number of relational interactions that our kids are having right now, it is at least 1/20 the number of relational interactions that were present for children in hunter-gatherer clans. So we have these primitive cultures that provided pattern, repetitive social experiences that helped express those children's capacity to be engaged, empathic, and meaningful contributing members of their living group. Now, we provide lots of pattern, repetitive experiences for our kids, but mostly they're cognitive. We, as a society, we value cognition, which we should. The cortex and the ability to read and the ability to think in this abstract way, that's an incredible, incredible capability which should be expressed. But unfortunately, I don't believe that we are culturally matching that wise choice of providing cognitive enrichment with an equally wise choice of providing social emotional enrichment. Our kids and we ourselves are experiencing poverty of relationships. And the consequence of that is impacting our mental health, our physical health, our productivity, and our creativity. Any of you who sort of read the corporate literature, any of you who've been tracking all of this stuff, you know that these soft skills are the best predictors of success for a corporation. In fact, one of my good buddies, Rich Karlgaard, actually went to high school with him, just published a book called The Soft Edge, which is all about how trust and relationships make a bigger difference in the success of a corporation than hard skills. And again, he's not saying don't learn those hard skills, but if you have all kinds of hard skills and you have no soft skills, guess what? You're not going to succeed. We need to think more carefully about what kinds of pattern, repetitive experiences we're providing for our children. And linked to this is the second great gift of our biology that we are being disrespectful of in our current inventing process, and that is the malleability of the human brain early in life. The human brain is remarkably malleable and adaptable, but it is most malleable when it is rapidly developing early in life. In other words, your biggest bang for your buck in trying to create a healthy, productive, regulated, compassionate human being is early in life. And again, this isn't saying don't invest in things later in life. It's just that if we would spend more time thinking about how to create consistent, predictable, nurturing, safe environments for young parents and their children, we would be able to spend much less money in our special education systems, our mental health systems, our juvenile justice systems. We would divert people out of these negative trajectories, and it would save our culture billions of dollars, which we could then spend on soft skills, other things. And we could use our money for other things. This is the thing. This is why I like talking to people like you. You aren't helpless. You can actually learn about these concepts and think about how to apply them in your family, in your community, and in your governmental agencies. And the interesting thing is that there's a tremendous amount of evidence that this is a sensible thing to do. The Nobel laureate in economics in the year 2000 has done a complete economic analysis of the return on investment for educational time. And the biggest return on investment is for at-risk kids in high-quality early childhood environments. There's a study that was just published 2 weeks ago in Science that showed that not only does that kind of high-quality investment increase academic outcomes and IQs and stuff like that, 25 years later, those individuals are physically healthier. It changes the physiology of their brain in ways that influences their neuroimmune, neuroendocrine, autonomic nervous system functioning, such that they're physically healthier, they're socially more reasonably organized, and they're cognitively more capable of expressing their potential. And so any society that understands and invests in early childhood is going to benefit tremendously. And I would say that one of the challenges that we have in this generation is that we are changing as the demographics of our society are changing so rapidly that the rate at which our systems can adapt and cope to these changes is too slow. We are not making adaptations quick enough to solve the current problems. And so by the time we reorganize our child welfare system in response to the problems that were present 10 years ago, we've got new issues in child welfare. It's like, holy hell, by the time we figure this out, make a new organization, make a new policy, make a new practice, we've got a whole new wave of other things. This is the challenge that we have right now. The rate at which we are changing is faster than the rate at which we are solving these problems. And we're, as they say in baseball, we're behind the pitch. The way to get ahead of the pitch is to look at the way human beings are biologically organized and take advantage of these two gifts, the gift of malleability of early childhood and the gift of human neurobiological of interconnectedness. If we start to act on those two things, we can see a quantum leap in productivity, creativity. Let me just say one example of acting on that, just to give you a feel for how powerful it is when we create policy, practice, and law that's resonant with our biology. Now, many of you may or may not know this, but there was a time when public education was unknown, right? And that people did not get cognitive enrichment. Public education was basically a relatively new thing a few hundred years ago. Scotland, in large part because they were Protestant and they didn't want those Catholics dominating, reading the Bible, they went into all their little kirks, which are like these little, they're counties, basically church-based counties, and they said, we're going to have a school. We're going to teach everybody to learn how to read their own language so they can read the Bible in their own language. And so they actually created a form of public education. And by, way before any other part of the world was literate, they were like 60% literate when the rest of the UK was about 20% literate. And it's no surprise then that in that next generation and the generation after that, the Scots essentially invented codification, the steam engine, that small group of just a few million educated people who created policy and practice that acted on this biological reality that doesn't matter if you're poor or if you're black or if you're a woman, that your brain can be enriched through education. When they did that, when they took their poor kids and gave them public education, they ended up with inventors and creators. And that tiny little group of individuals ended up transforming Western civilization. This has happened many times. Whenever a human living group creates policy, practice, or law that's resonant with biological reality, we benefit. And one of the most powerful biological realities that we have to act on is this incredible malleability of the brain and the absolute power of relational neurobiology. This is how powerful relational neurobiology is. If you take a high-risk, at-risk kid in the middle school and you pair that person with a mentor who stays with them, just comes in, no expectations. I'm just going to get to know you. I'm going to come and have lunch with you every week. And we're going to sit down and talk about whatever. I'm going to form a relationship with you that's enduring. If that mentor stays with that kid all the way through high school, the probability that he'll graduate is increased by 20%. That's how powerful relationships are. And that's how simple it is when you tap into the way we're organized, there's this incredible resonance and between what we seek, what we enrich, what we become, that leads to positive things. When we fight our biology, which we do all the time in a lot of the things that we've created, we have a hard time. In education, for example, fighting biology involves having one teacher and 30 kids. That's kind of fighting biology. That's a biologically disrespectful model for teaching. You could get information into the brains of those kids more effectively if there was a more dyadic relational medium. Now, that's sort of a challenge, but there are ways that we can think about how to take advantage of relational interactions. Classic example is a one-room, the old classic one-room school where there were heterogeneous developmental models where the older kids could teach the younger kids. It created an enrichment of the ratio. It wasn't all dependent on the teacher. There's a lot of interesting and creative things that we can do to increase the number and quality of relational interactions in the lives of our kids, and we have to think about how to do that. And there's a lot of things that we can do, and there's a lot of great programs about how to create high-quality early childhood environments for struggling parents and for non-struggling parents that can tap into this incredible capability. Some of them are taking place right here in this community. Now, I could go on and on, but I think that isn't it time for us to talk? So I'm sure that I've kicked the beehive a little bit here, so there's a lot to talk about, and I guess that's the next part of this presentation. So, thank you.
Dr. Perry. Man, I'm conflicted. I'm inspired by your brilliance, but I'm in a depressed emotional state about relational poverty. I just tweeted my state 500 of my closest friends. Let's talk a little bit about relational poverty in the context of reactionary policy. So if we are not as great at building the social capital and other forms of coming together and working through our challenges and opportunities and brilliance together, how much more difficult it is in the era of the politics of fear and reactionary policy, and how can you deal with relational poverty at the same time you're dealing with reactionary policy? Simple little question.
Well, we were having a bit of a conversation before all of this about the fact that human cognition and actually human relational capabilities are what we would call state dependent. So when you feel safe and you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not cold, you're not resource challenged, you can actually use this really smart top part of your brain. And it's easier to be thoughtful and abstract and considerate and civil in a conversation. But when you feel threatened, when anybody feels threatened, what happens is the brain essentially starts to shift what networks are on and what networks are off. And one of the first things that happens is that smart part of your brain starts to get shut down. You start to view things more categorical. And there's this really interesting double-edged sword about the neurobiology of human, the neurobiology of human relatedness. And that is that, as I talked about earlier, that human beings are meant to live and work in these groups. And so most of us grow up let's take primitive hunter-gatherer clan. You grow up in an environment and you see all of these different people who are part of your group. And they talk a certain way, and they dress a certain way, and they use their hands a certain way when they communicate. And then when you go out and you're out, following the game and looking for places to get berries and stuff, you run into another human being. Now, the sad reality of our species is that our major predator is us. Human beings are actually, historically, have been our major predator. And so the default response when you meet somebody who's different from you is that it's defensive. It's like, oh my gosh, you're just as likely to compete with me or try to take from me or hurt me as you are to help me. And so the default response to novelty, particularly relational novelty, people that are different, is to be defensive and categorical. And it activates your stress response. And when you feel threatened, you're much more likely to fall prey to an us and them mentality. And so one of the things that's happened, I think, in the last, certainly since I've been old enough to pay attention to politics, is that things have become more shrill. There's more name-calling, there's more antagonism, and honestly, one of the things I think contributes to this is talk radio. I think that if you listen to some of the talk radio on both sides, it's vitriolic, it gets personal. And so what that does is people start to, when they feel attacked, then they start to get defensive, and then they'll attack back, and it creates this really incredibly toxic environment for meaningful compromise or dialogue.
So let's get really pragmatic on that. So what advice would you give to an early childhood advocate who faces this politics of fear and, hey, if we push for early childhood, that's a government takeover, or we don't have the money for it. Right. So if we are facing a traumatized political brain, what pragmatic things have you seen about how an early childhood advocate can get into the political story without getting into the shrill, can really bring the research or bring the story to reality? What can they do?
That's, honestly, I wish I knew for sure. I mean, I've been trying to help different groups understand some of these things and think about ways to act on this information for a long time. And initially, when I first started out as an academic and I was kind of naive, I thought, gosh, we'll just show them the data. Yeah, I know.
Only took 10 years for you to
Let me tell you a great story. This is a great story, and I'm not, this is a true story. I'm in an unnamed state.
Does not have the letter O in it.
It does, actually. But it wasn't your O.
Oh, not our own.
Anyway, so I was involved in this big public engagement campaign about early childhood and brain development that was spearheaded by Rob Reiner 15 or 16 years ago. And at that time, these ideas were pretty foreign to a lot of people, including people in the field. And so there was a lot of pushback, and there were people that said, well, where's the data, blah, blah, blah. And most of those people didn't really read neuroscience that much. They read their own journals, which is an issue of that compartmentalization that we have everywhere. But, so I get these opportunities, though, to go to talk to governors and talk to, the president, and all kinds of people. It's crazy. I'm a small town kid from North Dakota, and I'm meeting with all these people. So anyway, I get to one of these states, and I do this presentation to the Speaker of the House of their state legislature, and then the governor. And they go, well, what's the data? I said, well, there was just a publication of some really good stuff from David Olds about nurse family practitioner model where you do home visitation, and it diverts kids out as they get older. More graduate, fewer of them end up in the juvenile justice system, and that's just been published, at least the update on that. And the governor looks at me and he says, well, where'd they do that study? And I said, well, it was in Elmira, New York. And he said, you're from North Dakota. You know those kids in New York are different than the kids out here in Idaho. And I just was horrified. I'm like, I didn't even know what to say. I said, well, I think their brains are probably pretty similar. But the point is, to your point, that it's like, data just didn't matter. So to answer that question, the one thing that we found that makes a difference, and I know this is probably not very reassuring, what really matters is who you know. It's who you know. And so if you know the governor of some state, and you can have a conversation with him or with her, I have never had somebody look at the fundamental concepts and go, well, I don't get it, or that doesn't make sense. The problem is, even after people hear it, how they act on it, how they would solve that problem completely starts to get polarized. Some people say, well, what that means is we shouldn't try to help people after they're 10 years old because, the brain's already developed. I'm like, no, that's not what we're saying or we'd recommend. But we haven't figured out how to get through everybody's lens of bias.
Right. Well, I think one of the things I'd emphasize, we've tried it's a health issue. Yeah. We've tried it's an economic issue. Yeah. We even tried it's a moral issue. How refreshing. But the spin I heard that I'd never heard till today was it's a biological imperative. That, to me, is a little different notion of the argument here.
Well, I'm actually happy to hear you say that because I gave this kind of talk, started thinking about it this way after I tried these rational arguments. And not that it's irrational to say that this is a fundamental biological imperative, but this is a challenge. This really is. You can actually take up the gauntlet or not, but I'm telling you, you can take this information and transform the future, or you cannot. Let the inertia of the crap we're doing now just carry us to the next generation, and we'll limp along, we'll make little tweaks here and there, but I honestly, understanding this information almost leads you to think about the need for a movement as opposed to a program. This isn't about just tinkering around with changing the child welfare policy or getting a new, what's the best assessment method. This is a cultural transformation about what we value, what we don't value, how we're deciding, how we're making choices about how we live our lives. And it's bigger. So I think you're right. I think that for some people, making the argument that way is big enough for them to say, I'm going to take a look at this.
So I'm going to flip it on you really quickly. Go from a telescope, policy, politics, and culture, to a microscope, a practice. So from policy to practice, I'm going to flip it. So imagine these people aren't here. And imagine I am everyday teacher.
Yep.
Kindergarten teacher, early learning teacher.
Right.
And I just want to have an honest conversation with you about what you can tell me of what I can do in my practice around this. And let me just tell you my reality.
Yeah.
You can talk soft skills, but if I don't deal with school readiness, academic preparation, I'm in trouble. If we can't beat Finland, I'm in trouble.
Yep.
My evaluation is tied to it, a variety of things.
Yep.
I know I had 8 kids that were either beat up last night by an alcoholic parent, or didn't sleep last night, or didn't eat, and I have to deal with them today. But I got to focus on academic press.
Yep.
Help me.
Sure.
Because
In fact,
help me.
I actually was lucky enough yesterday to speak to a couple of different groups of educators in exactly that position. And one of the things that is very helpful is that if you want to get those hard skills, you want to get that content into their cortex, you have to basically follow the routes by which the brain processes information. And so everybody in this room, when you see me or hear me or when you touch somebody, all of that sensory input, the first place that comes into is in the lower parts of your brain. And then it gets processed and acted on, it goes to the middle part, and then it goes to the top part. So in order for you to get content to the cortex, you have to go through these lower parts of the brain. And so the fundamental simple principle that we teach educators is that you regulate, you relate, then you reason. And if you use that sequence and help teachers build in regulatory strategies for a classroom, even if a child's coming from chaos, threat, they're going to be much easier to teach. And so there are actually school districts, the Westerville School District has incorporated a lot of these simple concepts into their work and had significant improvement in a lot of outcomes, just like a lot of other school districts that we've worked with. But simple things like starting the class with 10 minutes of pattern, repetitive, rhythmic, regulatory stuff, whether it's breathing or some form of exercise or listening to music. But what we know is that when people are regulated, more of their brain is accessible both to retrieve previously stored experience, but also to put new experience in. And so if you want to be most effective in helping these kids who are really dysregulated in a behavioral problem, think about ways to bring rhythm and regulatory activities into the class. And there are really hundreds of wonderful creative examples that educators have come up with, like using hip hop to teach math. The reason it's easy to learn math when you're doing hip hop is that it's rhythmic. It's regulatory. These kids actually, it's easier to get content into your cortex in rhythm than it is not in rhythm. And so there's these kids who we'll talk about who have learning problems, and we'll think about how their verbal parts of their brain are put together, and then you find out, well, they literally know page after page after page of hip hop lyric. It's not like they can't get content, verbal content in their head. It's just how we choose to put it up there. What I'd recommend for all of you to sort of get a handle on some of that rhythm and cognition stuff is to watch the movie Akeelah and the Bee. It's a great film because it's about how she jump ropes and she uses other rhythmic things to memorize this huge vocabulary thing. And she does, she's in a spelling bee, and then she has to sort of do this regulatory thing to recall what she had stored. And so that's one of the things that I would teach in a real pragmatic way.
So heads up to the audience. We're going to switch the audience after one final question, so start lining up over here at the microphone. So talk a little bit more. You gave an example of regulate. Give me an example if you were helping teachers to relate. What are some things from your work that can help teachers relate?
It's, again, one of the fundamental points that we try to emphasize is that if the teacher himself or herself is regulated, then it will be so much easier for them to do the natural sort of stuff that pulls them to be connected to kids. Because very few teachers sort of choose to go into teaching because they hate kids, right? I mean, they some do. That's a whole different lecture. But mostly they choose, they enjoy being with kids. They want to do this. But when they're put under a pressure cooker and they're given all these standards and all this stuff, what happens to them is they have stress-related cognitive shifts. And so their ability to really be present with a child and to sort of sincerely say, that was really awesome, in the way a kid can feel it, that's inhibited when they're distressed. So the first thing that we talk to them about is, you got to take care of yourself. You need a self-care plan. You need to be regulated. You need to talk with the principal about getting somebody in here to help you so you can go take your 5-minute walk. And that will help the teacher be so much easier for the teacher to relate. And this co-regulation thing, when a regulated teacher, because of the contagion of the human beings, we're very relational creatures, so we're contagious. And so if the teacher's upset, that will make the kids also mirror her dysregulation. But if the teacher is regulated, that can take dysregulated kids and make them feel better regulated. And so helping the teacher recapture his or her awareness about how powerful they are and how many strengths they have that they can bring to bear in the classroom. But I'll tell you what, anybody, doesn't matter how bright you are, how relationally skilled you are, if you're under the pressure cooker that you're talking about, it's very hard to be a teacher in this day and age.
Yeah, I don't think I've been regulated since 1994, to be honest with you. So it is CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please go to the microphone, state your name, and ask your question. We thank you in advance for avoiding long editorial comments. And I deserve the right to say, that's a long editorial comment. Please ask your question. Yes, ma'am. State your name and your question.
My name is Liz Hickson, and I have a 17-year-old grandson out in California, and he was adopted at age 4, and he has a lot of struggles with his studies and with depression, and he's getting help and everything. But I just wonder, do you find that adopted children have more issues than natural children?
Well, if you sort of just as a group look at adopted children, you tend to see that they have higher rates of academic and mental health issues. But it's like any group of human beings, that's a very heterogeneous group. So we know that if you have been adopted from child welfare, there's a high probability that you were exposed to some chaos, neglect, and so forth, and that can impact how you develop. And then there are a lot of kids that have been adopted from international settings where not all, but many of those environments are kind of what we would call neglectful. They may have been clean and they may have provided food, but a lot of them were very relationally impoverished. And so when you lump in sort of those kids into the broader adoptive population, that probably accounts for the vast majority of the differences that people see. So it's not a given, but it's not uncommon for kids to have more struggles when they have been adopted.
So a quick follow-up to that. Parents, teachers, the brain is still a black box. We don't have the brain scans, we can't see it.
Yeah.
And so we tend to fall to labels.
Yeah.
It's because they're X, they're Y.
Exactly.
What about your work can be translated in a practical way to say, this is what you should look for in trying to understand that brain before you?
Right. Well, we actually have been working on trying to make the brain less of a black box by helping people appreciate that certain functions that we can readily see in everyday interaction are mediated by different systems in the brain. So if you want to get sort of if you think of the brain as, in this overly simplistic way as kind of an upside down triangle, the top is the cortex, this really smart part, and the bottom is the brainstem that regulates your heart rate. And then there's a few things in between. You can come up with a heuristic, in other words, a model of the brain for a person by looking at simple things like, what's their fine motor control? Is their handwriting age typical or is it worse than age typical? And you can say, there's some systems that we know that influence that. And how about their social skills with peers? And how about their reading skills compared to peers? And so you can sort of look at a bunch of functions that are mediated by the brain and essentially create a heuristic of the brain. And then we use that to essentially help people, both educators and parents and children themselves, figure out the way they're organized in ways that help us target both the selection and the sequencing of enrichment and therapeutic services. So,
Next question.
Todd Tooney, Columbus Metropolitan Club and also City Year. And first of all, this is just fascinating. I want you to know that, and I really appreciate you being here, Dr. Perry. And I'm also kind of intrigued by the fact that I know this audience is filled with educators and people that work with children. And I know that's also a curious bunch, so you must have stunned everybody in this room with what you shared with us today, because no one else is standing up to ask a question.
Did you consider maybe I asked such great questions? Did you consider that?
Yes.
Okay.
I will for you, Brad. I will for you.
Your question.
So, and knowing that we have a lot of different programs that are out here designed to provide a lot of the things that you've already indicated that our children need to help support them not only in early education, adolescence, and education systems as a whole, like how do we do a better job of coordinating all these efforts to better kind of get the results that we're looking for, and maybe even start to think about this kind of a collective movement that you've kind of described? How do we get there?
That's a good question. We have, I just came back from the UK where I was meeting with people there a little bit about this issue of how do we actually take a community where we have a lot of good things happening but kind of piecemeal and not organized and integrated, and make sure that we aren't doing things that are redundant, try to make sure that there aren't gaps in the developmental ladder, because it's amazing how often we can have a really high quality program for a mother who's at risk, and as soon as the baby's born, we wave goodbye and say, well, by the way, when the kid gets to be 3, we've got another good program, but in between, good luck with that whole raising the kid thing. So we really need to think more carefully about how to do community inventories of what is going on. And I think I've several communities that, like, there's a Nottingham and there's a Belfast, both actually have done a really good job of creating inventories about existing programs and looking at where the gaps are. And so again, we might have a really high quality early childhood program in this part of Belfast, but we've got nothing over here. And so they use that in their planning about how do we grow this capacity linearly, how are we going to build another capacity vertically, and it's something that is hard to do in the US because we don't typically have the same kind of convening bodies that are available in some other settings. And so sometimes in a community in the US, what we've seen is leadership has been provided by the local pediatric hospital, or leadership has been provided by the United Way that convenes people. But in this community, you guys have, Jane, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but that's kind of what you all are trying to do, right?
We are, and I think we're seeing emerging lots of partners like the Children's Hospital, like United Way, like all of those pieces are coming together for us, and a lot of interest in the community.
Yeah.
Really good support.
And in that process, going back to some of our earlier comments, one of the things that's a major downfall is that we end up replicating sort of this very primitive form of tribalism. And so what we do is if we're in one system, we basically have an us or them. Like, well, they don't really do it the right way. What they really should do is they should use this measure. And of course, when there's limited resources, just like in the real world, the real primitive world we all came from, if we're competing for limited resources, we don't collaborate. We basically damn each other with faint praise. In fact, it's true. I'm telling you, the major impediments to much progress in this field it's not the corporate sector, it's not lawyers, it's us. We basically cut each other's throats because we're competing for limited resources. And this is something that's, yeah.
So just so you all know, that was not fake praise I said just a minute ago.
Let's move to our next question. A good segue. Next question.
Hello, my name's Phil Cass. I'm with the Columbus Medical Association. I'm curious, the literature, it seems to me, is exploding on the benefits of mindfulness practice
Yep.
with brain development.
Yep.
And I'm curious how you're seeing that in relationship to your work, early childhood brain development and so
Yeah.
on.
The practice of mindfulness and it's very resonant with our work. We use different terminology about than a lot of the folks that are sort of practicing and teaching mindfulness, but it's really very much the same thing about the positive benefits of being fully present, and particularly when you're interacting with another person, bringing that capacity to kind of tune everything else out, to be regulated, to be relationally connected, and it leads to a very different kind of sincere and powerful connection. And so we're sort of hand in glove with the mindfulness concepts. And one of the things that we've seen that's been very exciting is the incorporation of some mindfulness practices into school settings, where it helps both educators and children stay in that better regulated state, and it really promotes and facilitates positive relational reward, and in ways that are, we think, pretty unique and very powerful. So we're very on board with that stuff.
Next question.
John Farley, the Educational Council. I was struck at the beginning of your presentation by your description of what you referred to as primitive gather societies and the opportunities they provided for youngsters as opposed to our current society, the lack of relationship building. I'm wondering if you have seen evidence of a concept that's probably over 20 years old now called the developmental assets theory.
Yep.
And whether or not you have seen that. I know in Franklin County there's at least one school district that is intentionally putting this into practice with the developmental assets, 40 developmental assets, 20 that are met or fostered in school, but the other 20 out of school. So the focus is on providing a number of adults, just like you described at the beginning, that a child can turn to. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
I'm familiar with that program, that approach. I like it, a lot of things about it, because it's, when you talk about these things, at some point people say, well, what should I do? You know, what does that mean? And so the nice thing about that program is it's very concrete. You know, here are these concrete things. And so from my perspective, you can take almost all of those things that are part of those developmental assets and connect them to increasing the quality or the density of relational interactions in the life of a child. And so we have a whole bunch of things that we think do that. You know, whether a child decides to get involved in after-school sports or after-school orchestra or all kinds of things. And when you look at these, when you look across the board at things that have positive outcomes, either in tracking academic things or mental health things, you really can't find something that hasn't somehow manipulated in a positive way the relational milieu. And so what we try to do across the board is see whether or not there are consistent elements that can be found in programs that work really well. And so we find that we like a lot of programs, but we're very promiscuous about which ones they are. We think that programs are kind of a vehicle to get people connected in the right way and to arm people with the right tools to use once they do get connected to the right folks. So, you know, we like big brothers and big sisters when it's done right. We like, there's literally lots of doula programs. We like, I like sort of cooperative babysitting things that can develop in communities. Anything in my head that sort of creates opportunities for people to be together in healthy ways, I think that's great. One of my favorite sets of programs are around doing developmental clustering, where you take the elderly and you bring them into a school, or you co-house an elder care setting with a child care setting, and you just make people get mixed together. And that's really some cool things.
Final question.
Well, it's not really a question, and I never thought I'd come here and say, boy, I have to get this said, but that's how I feel. I've talked to some of the teachers that use some of these techniques, and the one thing that I want everybody here to understand is this isn't flipping the world upside down. This is enriching how you touch children. And if you care about kids, like I think everybody does, I know some of you here, I know you're bright, I know you're bright.
Coming close to an editorial comment.
I know, I'm almost done. I've just seen the impact. I've talked to the teachers that are doing it, and it's wonderful. Bye.
Thank you. So, Dr. Perry, to be selfish, I wish this was Starbucks, and you and I could go another 3 hours and could get these people. But I want to thank you for one thing that you didn't know you did. My favorite professor in college was a Shakespeare scholar. And I once asked him, I said, what made Shakespeare brilliant? And he said the following, which I didn't understand until today. He said, what Shakespeare taught us was that you can love your way to reason, but you cannot reason your way to love.
That's brilliant. That's exactly.
So thank you.
That. Wow, I love that.
Thank you. So,
Thank you.
I didn't know it till now. So.
That's brilliant. Shakespeare was a smart guy. Yeah. Let's talk about rhythm, right? Yeah.
You two are having a conversation.
That's right.
And we're clapping through it.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we need to take a moment? So I hope you enjoyed today's forum. We encourage you to continue the conversation in our lobby over cookies and coffee. Once more, please thank our sponsors and partners, Bricker and Eckler, Jane Wide, and her team of Franklin County Family and Children First Council, and the Childhood League Center. And of course, let's thank our speakers, Brad Mitchell and Dr. Bruce Perry.